Hello, my name is Bryant Hunt, and my show tonight is called, my program is Discerning What is True. And hope you guys are having a good evening. Today is the 11th day of January 2023. Again, my channel is Discerning What is True. I'm going to be reading from John Coleman's work here. I'm going to take off where we were at earlier today. I did a video earlier today, starting out with page 37. So we're going to go there. And just give me a second here as I look for it here. I got to put in a certain type here. So here we go. So this book is called One World Order. That is Socialist Dictatorship. It is plainly evident to those who seek the truth that communism is not dead. It's only taking a temporary respite and is presently waking in the wings while socialism catches up. What we have today is what Karl Marx called scientific socialism. It was called psychopolitics by Professor Harold Lasky. President Kennedy adopted scientific socialism, his New Frontier program, taken directly from British Fabian Society blueprint, New Frontiers by Henry Wallace, New York, and written in 1934. So all these presidents, they don't do everything that they are told to do, so to speak. They do parts of it, you see. With Kennedy, he does this part, Eisenhower before him, Truman before him, President Roosevelt in his time there. And it's a partial thing. They ask for a lot to do, share and, put out. Some of these presidents decide, well, I'm going to do this, but I'm not keen on this idea. So it's just a piece by piece type of thing. It's not all done at 100%, the whole thing, you see. Psychopolitics was summed up by Charles Morgan in his book, Liberties of the Mind. We are all being conditioned to accept limitations of freedom. I fear that unconsciously, even if we are ready to accept this new infection, there is no immunity in the great mass of our people and no consciousness of danger. One can think of many ways in which the population as a whole is being conditioned or prepared for this mental change, this loss of individuality and identity. A clearer explanation of socialism boring away from within would be hard to find. Yeah, this is a demonstration of how the studies were done in the 60s and 70s with the mice. This all goes in context with Tavistock, also with the Frankfurt School. They studied the mice, and they discovered that basically there was harmony always in a certain way. But when they got a little too much, things started happening in a different way. That is the food. And suddenly the mice no longer wanted to be friends with each other. There was also biting one another. It means that simply as the whole mouse way of living was being destroyed. In other words, they're being conditioned. And they were given what they call plenty of water, plenty of food, plenty of sex, all these kinds of things. And what happened was it eventually destroyed itself. The rats began to become erratic. And then they no longer trusted one another. They started fighting one another, like biting each other. Even though they had plenty of room, plenty of everything they wanted, something happened. And that, I believe, is they've known this for a long time. And what they're doing is that they're destroying us from within. A lot of it has to do with simply is that the mice had I don't know if you want to call it love or so to speak, or friendship, whatever, but it seems as though everything was perfect to the point that they became spoiled, you see. And again, like I said, there were studies done in the 60s and 70s where they did they did 10 to 12 times this thing. They had these rats in the perfect place, everything, hospitable, whatever. But they did other tweaks to it and played with them and figured out simply how they began to destroy themselves, self-destruction. And that's what they're doing to us now. We are the labs. We are the mice in the labs, folks. You see. The socialists have been practicing psychopolitics upon the people of England and the United States since the appearance of Communist Manifesto in 1848. That is why we find in 1994 our senators arguing over the merits of one national health plan over another, and instead of rejecting outright the whole idea as a socialist subterfuge. Yeah, this is they know they don't. Well, they should know that this goes completely against our own constitutional form of government. Instead, they are, doing it nibble by nibble type of thing, trying to create a national health plan. The whole thing that even took place with President Obama, you see, and before that was another type of health plan. But the problem is simply this, as you notice, it's gotten worse and worse, payout. And many people are now paying tons and tons of money for this quote unquote national health plan by Obama that is eating them up immensely. And so they just continue to take this supposed government help, but in reality, it gets worse. You see. So anyway, as an entire book could be written on this particular subject alone. The Kennedy administration contained 36 Fabian socialists in his administration. 2 were cabinet members, 3 were White House aides, 2 were undersecretaries, and 1 was assistant secretary of state. The remainder were in policy-making positions of vital importance. This is why so many Kennedy-era policy decisions ran contrary to the best interests of the United States and its people, and seemed oddly at variance with what Kennedy said he stood for. Yeah, it's amazing that 100 years before this, now, there were no specialists. There were very few assistants. The government at that point was not overrun like it is with what we call bureaucracy, you see. And there are more and more people working for government, you see, in all different departments, everywhere. Not just in the White House, but everywhere. That means that simply things don't get done, folks. There's more and more people getting something of the pie, but it means simply is that the efficiency of government is becoming slower and slower. You see, it's no longer efficient. And it seems as though these people who are running for president for some reason, they think they know it all. That is, they think they know these people who they are given aids, and they think they can run over these people, whatever. And the presidents continue to be more reliant on them instead of being actually well studied. You see. Now, the president still makes that decision. You see, he makes the ballpark decision. He makes a yes or no, we're going to do this or not type of thing. But he has all these people around him, and they're conferring this and that. But in reality, can you trust any of these guys? No. So since the death of Kennedy, socialism has taken deep root in the United States, always watered and nurtured by those who are called liberals or moderates, and nursed with great bouts of tolerance. Colonel Mandel House and Sir William Wiseman, director of the North American Desk for British Intelligence, MI6, ran President Wilson, who became the first openly socialist American president to sit in the Oval Office. Yeah, Colonel Mandel House, considering going back to Wilson in 1908, I think it is. Yeah, I think that's correct. Don't hold me to it. 1912, 1908 to 12, and then he got in for after that. So it's 19. He actually served in 1916, although he did not. He was in very ill health in the last year or two of his administration. His wife was actually doing a lot of the administration deal, which is kind of interesting. You kind of wonder if that's constitutional or not. You see. Fabian socialist. Okay, yeah, the socialist goals never vary particularly in what they describe as the difficulties to be overcome. And these were, and in some instances still are involved. And these are religion, especially the Christian religion. Number 2 is national pride of nation states. The patriotism, number 3. The 4th one would be United States Constitution and state constitutionals. 5 would be opposition to gradual income tax. And 6 would be breaking down trade barriers. These goals are described in their blueprint called American Fabian Techniques based on obscurantism. The Fabian socialist movement was only interested in recruiting the elite of the British society. So they're not even looking at even Americans here at this point. Men like Clement Attlee, Sir Stafford Cripps, Cripps, Herbert Morrison, Emmanuel Shinwell, Ernest Belvin, Lord Grey, Lord Asquith, and Ramsay MacDonald, who went on to work on their will on England from Parliament. While these names may be foreign to American readers, these men played a vital role in directing the course the United States was to take, and as such are worthy of mention. You also get these guys are actually here. Some of these people are here for certain stays. They're speaking, but they're also in the neighborhood, so to speak, in the White House or in that vicinity of the Washington, D.C. area, in order to give, advice. An interesting sideline of Fabian society is that a committee determined that no more than 5% of the population was worthy of becoming good socialist leaders. Some British Fabian socialists played vital roles in changing the course and the directions of the United States. We shall return to that aspect. Fabian socialist MacDonald, who went on to become Prime Minister of England, was dispatched to the United States in 1893 to spy out the land. On his return on socialistic programs or progress in the United States, his written Constitution, federal and state, which gave ultimate power to a law court, MacDonald further stated that it would be necessary to work diligently to carry out the directives of Edward Bellamy, an American Fabian socialist. Most of us will know him as the author of this book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Yeah, that book. Yeah, the whole idea eventually will be create the issue of racism. Drafted by his mentor, Colonel Thomas Wentworth, a noted abolitionist, as a Fabian socialist as one could find. Yep. They all worked together. Bellamy was a true believer and follower of the British Fabian Society and one of the first American Fabian chapter members, writing in the American Fabian in February of 1895. So they're already beginning this. This is in the late 1800s, folks. 3 years before MacDonald delivered his fact-finding report of the tour of his United States, Bellamy stated, "Our Constitution, being largely individualistic, must be changed to admit socialism, and each change necessary to political crisis." This means the raising of great issues. And the key is individual freedom against the collectivism. That's the difference, folks. That's why the word community is used always now. Instead of individual rights, it's always used community, what their rights are. You see how this is being skewed? It was always that the individual and the minority themselves, that is those who were not a part of the 50% plus one, still had a right to do certain things. You see, that would be the way the individual would be, individual rights, freedoms. The problem is simply is they're bringing this whole idea of community. And we're going to do with another particular book here called Communitarianism. I'm going to deal with that. Need to read that book to you guys too. Well worth reading to give you an idea of what's really going on. Anyway, back to the book here. Didn't Wilson raise great issues, and didn't Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Bush do the same thing? And isn't it remarkable that Clinton is constantly raising great issues? This is a methodology of socialism, raising great issues like the so-called healthcare reform. And that's, actually, they've been doing this since the 60s in the Johnson administration. But you have to also understand that Nixon in 1971 destroyed the county hospital system here in America and allowed the corporations to be involved now. He had to pay back for what they wanted, and he gave them what they wanted. And so they gradually destroyed the idea of a county hospital in each county of the state usually. And then what they would do simply was they would run it at a cost. There was no idea of simply as, yes, they would want to be in the black, but the idea was simply not to make super profits. You see, pay for the needs, the drugs, or whatever you need, the supplies, whatever, the whole apparatus of the building, all that. But there was never the idea of making super amounts of money, you see. Herein lies the most explanation of the political actions taken by President Wilson, Roosevelt, all the way down to Clinton. Again, McDonald's proposals follows very precisely the model laid down by Bellamy. McDonald stressed that the need to alter the Constitution of the United States should be preeminent to the thinking of Fabian socialists. So this is the reason why they do. This is why they have statutes. This is why they have legalese. This is why they have code books, because they have completely abandoned the Constitution. But they've never, quote unquote, this is the key thing you have to understand here. You still have power, okay, as an individual. They never have, quote unquote, come in with another amendment to abolish the Constitution or parts of the bond. All they're doing is overlaying it. That's all they're doing. And they're teaching people that it's not as important. So what they've done is a very stealthy type of way of dismissing the Constitution. Okay. So we stress once again that Fabian socialists differ somewhat from European socialists, more especially in what is claimed to have no party affiliation. This would be true if we ignored the facts of the penetration and permeation it took over the British Labour and Liberal parties has now taken over the Democratic Party of the United States. And I would say now simply is at this point, they've taken over pretty much the Republican Party, because the Republican parties are just rhinos. It's just Republican in name only. They're not adhering to these things. They're not obeying their bylaws, what do you want to call it, the parties. They also always back down, never actually stand against anything. They don't stand against anything that's wrong. Very few of them. MacDonald reported that the underlying principle of the United States Constitution rests on the rights guaranteed by the Fifth Amendment, especially the right to own property as corollary to Isaac Newton's natural law. Therefore, said MacDonald, changing the Constitution was to be done in a obelisk, high, secretive way and over a period of many years. You see, he also pointed to the block to socialist tactics of penetration and permeation posed by the separation of powers between the three departments of government. MacDonald's words were an echo of what Bellamy had proposed in February of 1895. At least Bellamy was better educated in the Constitution than are the vast majority of judges and politicians in the day and age. He recently admitted that the Constitution of the United States was not flexible. This shows up the ignorance of Judge Ruth Ginsburg, lately appointed to the Supreme Court by Socialist President Clinton, who told the Senate Judicial Subcommittee hearing that the Constitution is flexible, whereas it is immutable. And the great vision of Fabian socialists of the 1890s was to revise the United States Constitution, that is, to reform it, although it appears on the surface that such a task was beyond his abilities. Fabian's ability to work silently and secretly was unfortunately underestimated and overlooked. It reminds me of the popular Frank Sinatra song about some ambitious ants in a rubber tree. The ants had no chance of taking the tree away in one operation, but they nevertheless accomplished the impossible, carrying it away leaf by leaf until the rubber tree was demolished. I believe this is a good analogy of how the Fabian socialists have been working since 1895, a task which is still ongoing to carry off the United States Constitution piece by piece. Bellamy and MacDonald might be described as visionaries, but they were Fabian socialist visionaries with definite ideas about how to succeed. The methods described by the American socialists called for establishing a socialist elite in the United States, and then schooling the elite cadre on how to take advantage of every local, state, and national crisis for the convert ends of socialism, and to gain support for each such idea through a well-organized penetration of the press. This crystallization of American Fabian socialism began in earnestly in 1905. This is why we have Homeland Defense here. What a word for. You see, always a crisis to gradually create a particular office in the federal government. And I'm trying to think of the other agency, another agency here. These have all been in the last 25 to 30 years. We have the, not only Homeland Security, we have also, we take care of you other ways. That's why we're involved. Like, you're going to have socialized medicine. Every time there's a crisis, which they create that crisis, just like they do in the money system, folks. They create the crisis in order to come along and change it. And people it's a little by little, so to speak. And then the other thing simply is when those people die, the people who are living don't know what's going on because they're not paying attention. They're always working, trying to make ends meet, so to speak. And so, they're completely oblivious of what's going on. The American Socialists also called for a form of cadre of Fabian socialist professors who in later years would act as advisors for series of presidents. Yeah, they covered everything, folks, thereby steering them in the directions of a grand design to socialize the United States. Thus, far left Marx and Lenin professors were drawn mainly from the ranks of Harvard University Law School, that his educational work was undertaken by the elite Harvard Socialist Club, which, when overlaid on the British Fabian Society, one of the few times they were bold enough to show their socialist colors, revealed a close match. Charter members of the Harvard Socialist Club included Walter Lippmann. Yes, sir, Walter Lippmann. Yeah, another traitor. One of those selected by McDonnell and Bellamy to establish a social elite cadre in the United States, Lieberman spent years penetrating the business world. The role played by Lieberman in turning this country towards Fabian socialism will be explored another time, as we shall see. Socialism in the inner circles of power were an enemy more to be feared than communism, folks. You see, there's not an enemy we should be afraid of, folks, in Moscow. It's not over there, okay? It's not there. It's in Washington, D.C., okay? The American public were never allowed to see it this way. As I have so often said in the past, the enemy in Washington is more to be feared than the enemy in Moscow, he's saying. The average American, when he did hear anything about socialism under its own label, was repelled. In the 1890s, the American Fabian Society was a fledgling organization much in need of guidance, especially in the technique of going slowly and obscuring its goals. Then when socialism was mentioned at all, it conjured up visions of weird sexual practices. What? That's right. Which today socialists are striving to make culturally acceptable, and how to make the dole welfare affordable for everybody. Thus, it was not taken seriously except by a handful of scholars who saw it as a great danger in Bolshevism, at least in America, that is. And when Engels, the deceptive practice role model of socialism and Marxism, visited the United States in 1886, a mistake was made by promoting his vitriolic book, Origins of the Family, which later became the Bible for the abortionists, the homosexuals, and the so-called women's lib movement of Molly Yard, Molly Yard, by Patricia Schroeder of Eleanor Smear. There is some proof that the purpose of the visit by Engels was to lay the foundation of the new American Fabian Socialist Club. Similar, when Eleanor Marx, that is Karl Marx's daughter, who was known to be the mistress of George Bernard Shaw, toured the United States with another lover. This time, the live-in was Edward Aveling, Aveling. Public reaction was highly unfavorable. The public uproar about free love caught European socialists by surprise, having no idea just how entrenched Christian values were in America's society at that time. They had miscalculated in espousing free love, the basis of abortion, free love without responsibility, and their attack on the values of the family brought nothing but angry responses. This taught the American socialists a big lesson. More haste was a losing philosophy. It had to be made haste slowly. But the socialists never gave up, though, never lost sight of their goals, and the result today, the evils of socialism dominate America on every hand, gaining strength culturally, religiously, and social acceptance as they never did when Engels and Eleanor Marx and Edward Aveling were touring their wares. Readers are probably aware that Aberlin was the official translator from German to English of Das Kapital, the best known of works written by Marx. In order to deflect criticism away from socialism, the British Fabian Society decided to form a group in the United States that became known as the American Economic Association, which convened on September 9, 1885. Only the elite cadre of American socialists in the making were invited to attend. It was following this meeting that the British Fabian Socialists decided that MacDonald would have to visit the United States to ascertain what problems were in the way of socialism and how to overcome them. The AEA, the American Economic Association, drew all the leading socialists and would-be socialist leaders of the day to Saratoga, New York on September 9, 1885. Many of the distinguishing guests, as they were described in the New York newspapers, were leading socialist professors. Among them, Woodrow Wilson, who was to become the first openly socialist president in the United States. Others in attendance were Professor Eli, E-L-Y, H.R. Adams, John R. Commons, and E. James. I don't know why I said E. James. And then Dr. E.R. Silliman of Columbia, and Dr. Albert Shaw and E.W. Bemis, B-E-M-I-S, who went on to become the leading disciple of socialism in America. None were known outside of their limited academic service circles by far. I'm looking at these names here, and I don't know any of these people except Seligman. That's the only one I know of. None of these other people, I don't even know who they are. You see, none were known outside, like I said, in academic service, and socialism was not giving any thought as a serious threat to the American way of life. This was a mistake that was to be made many, many times in the future. One which is being repeated today. From this small beginning has grown the oak tree of socialism in the United States, whose spreading branches now threaten the Confederate Republic of the United States. Wilson, then at Bryn-Mawr College, that is Brynmawr College, went on to teach socialism at the Philadelphia University Extension in 1902, disguised as political science. So this is Wilson already, Woodrow Wilson, being already moving in that direction. Okay, he's already bought into the whole idea. There, he was immersed with other leading socialists in promoting socialist ideas and teaching. Including the list of socialist professors were British Fabian Society members such as Sidney Webb, R.W. Arden, and Edward R. Pease. Please. It's not please, but it's P-E-A-S-E. Eli and Adams, two of his American socialists we have already mentioned. Other prominent American socialists who fed Wilson on the diet of their socialist idea were Morris Hillquit and Upton Sinclair. You naturally recognize Upton Sinclair for sure. Their contacts with British Fabian socialists extended to meeting held at Oxford between 1805 and 1901. Dr. Seligman of Columbia University sponsored the meeting and is credited with the foresight of having the presidency go to Wilson. The similarity between the rise of Wilson and eventually later on Clinton is quite remarkable. Yes, it is, because Wilson was not even considered a serious candidate at all. And he was a former president of the school there at Princeton. He already started progressive ideas there when he was there for a short while. And then he was asked to run for governor of New Jersey. And then he won in New Jersey, which was another surprise. And then he was running against two other particular guys, which is Taft, who was actually the incumbent. And then they had Theodore Roosevelt running as a third-party candidate. And Wilson won. He won, and then he won again. He won twice. He won 2 terms. That was not expected at all. In fact, most felt that Taft would win it easily. But you got to understand why a third-party candidate always comes in and takes the votes away, usually for the person that they want to eliminate. And that was to Taft. And actually, Wilson won, and there was plenty of money poured into all 3 candidates, but they preferred Wilson to be the one. You see, he was well groomed already for them. Both were strongly socialist by persuasion, but were surrounded by a large number of socialistic intellectuals, and both had socialist ideas indelible imprinted on them through contract with Oxford University. Wilson was greatly influenced by such Fabian socialist publications as The New Freedom, Moreover, he was the first United States president to accept universal professors as advisors, a radical departure from past traditions and an outright socialist strategy. Methodology of forcing unwanted, unacceptable changes upon the American people. The rationale was that nobody would suspect academics of infamous purpose. Yeah, Wilson's joke. Seriously, he had a big ego. But he was played. He was very much played, just like Eisenhower was. He was played. There were sheep on the White House lawn at that one time, and he said he accused that basically that these people were the sheep. The American people were sheep. What a very arrogant attitude. What a piece of crap. But, this is what happens, you see. But, Wilson was controlled by Colonel Mandel House immensely. In fact, basically, he couldn't tie his shoestring, so to speak, without him being there. But anyway, Dr. Albert Shaw, who got Wilson elected by splitting the vote, which I just told you about, as Dr. Seymour said, and you got to understand, there's big time money involved in this, folks. The industrialists and the bankers are pushing for these candidates, and they wasn't pushing as much for Taft as they were for Theodore Roosevelt or Wilson. The suffragists included House denouncing Roosevelt as a wild radical, and it worked. Wilson became the president of the United States, and his friend Albert Shaw was appointed to the Labor Committee to reward when Wilson entered the White House. Although carefully concealed from the public, the British Fabian Socialists selected Wilson based on his prosperity for socialist issues and on the strong recognition of House, whose brother-in-law was Dr. Sidney Mezes, M-E-Z-E-S, was a longtime affiliate of the British Fabian Society and president of City College of New York. Mezes played a prominent role in pre- and post-World War socialist planning. Added to this was that a large percentage of members of the Fabian Society were Marxists. One of the most notable in the London Fabian Society was Professor Harry Lasky, which we've talked about him quite a bit, L-A-S-K-I, who went on to play a profoundly disruptive role socializing in the United States right up to the time of his death in 1952. It is not disputed that Bernard Baruch, B-I-R-U-C-H, who went on to be Wilson's absolutely comptroller during his years in the White House, was also a Marxist. Now, I want to explain to you, Woodrow Wilson is the only quote-unquote professor who actually won in office as president. And unfortunately, he was a political science professor. He was also a president of the New Jersey College. I'm trying to think of all of a sudden, Princeton. So the entire agenda for Woodrow Wilson's presidency was set up by the socialist advisors, both here and in Britain. One of the first, as Wilson's socialist efforts, was to federalize powers that were prohibited to the federal government, being reserved to several states. This included the police powers of health, education, labor, and police protection guaranteed to the states by the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution. In later years, Professor Harold Lasky was to put great pressure on President Roosevelt to break down and destroy through executive action the separation of powers between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government. This was the key to the back door of breaking down and making the Constitution of no effect. One of the main items on Wilson's agenda was the destruction of custom tariffs. Yes, very much so. Which up to 1913 had provided the United States with enough income, hello folks, to pay the bills of the nation and still have a surplus. You heard that right. That was the intention of the Constitution all along. There was no other taxes, you see. It was always to import taxes and allow people here in this country to benefit and to produce products, whatever it was, come from farm supplies or whatever, and they would be self-sufficient here and not being dependent upon another foreign country. And that's the way it should be, okay? The hidden agenda was to destroy this source of income and replace it with a Marxist-inspired gradual income tax. Yes, to begin to put the burden not on import taxes, but on the people, you see. And apart from what else it would achieve, the Marxist gradual income tax was designed to forever burden the middle class. That's what you're seeing right before your eyes right now. And if there's no middle class, there's no hope for the poor folks. It's that simple, you see. Because the rich are all up there, the few. And the middle class is what I call a large group, was a large group, but that is shrinking. And then you're seeing the poor expanding. And you do know that the Marxists, that is in Soviet Union, they used the peasants. They fooled them, which were the poor, and used them to destroy what we call their middle class, you see. But they got burned immensely themselves. They were killed. Once they were used, they were gone. Apart from what else would achieve, the Marxist gradual income tax was designed to forever burden the middle class, as I just said. It will be recalled that one of the principal obstacles that Ramsay MacDonald said had to be overcome was resistance to gradual income tax. Thanks to President Wilson, the British Fabian Society was able to impose this odious burden on the American people, thus realizing one of their cherished ambitions. It's necessary to say this and to say it loud and clear. Communism, although the originator, did not bring gradual income tax to the United States, folks. It was socialism. This was the work of the British Fabian Society. For the past 76 years, the American people have been damned into believing that communism is the biggest danger to the free world, because that's part of their PR, you see. We hope that in the pages of this book will be found enough evidence to point out that the dangers from socialism transcend anything thus far seen from communism. See, socialism comes in as a very light type of thing. You see, it's like little clouds that come over. Meanwhile, the clouds are getting a little bit more in the socialism. But the communists is what you see. It's like a major thunderstorm, snowstorm, and everything happening, which people are well aware and are understanding what's coming, such and such. But not socialism. So socialism has wrought 1,000 more times havoc within the United States than communists ever did. Twice found to be also, you do remember that there were candidates running on a Socialist Party deals back in the 1890s to the 1920s. And some of them got 5% of the vote, which was a tremendous amount of vote at that time. But they were not going to use these guys because that was just another way. They were using the same old two political party system, you see. They were not going to use the Socialist Party to win the White House because, frankly, no one would vote for that. It would be so much out in the open, you see. Everything's stealth here. Twice found to be unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court, gradual income tax was proposed to Wilson by the British Fabian Society, and its passage, urged by the American Fabian Society, was finally realized in 1916, just in time to pay for the World War I. It was not only that, the Federal Reserve was also involved, and they just created money out of nothing already, too, folks. And they stole the gold. While the American people had their attention focused on events through Europe, the 16th Amendment was slipped through Congress, aided and abetted by a whole flock of socialist legislators. Back in the 1890s, there were two times actually they tried to pass the gradual income tax. It was defeated easily. This time it didn't. The 16th Amendment, not ever having been ratified by all the states, it hasn't, folks, never was, remains outside the pale and king of the Constitution, but that has not stopped the socialist leaders from having their way. Wilson attempted to equate democracy with the Democratic Party, while in fact there could be no such party. The correct title should be the Democrat Party. We cannot have a democracy party in a Confederate Republic or a constitutional republic. Wilson's book, The New Freedom, actually written by socialist William B. Hague, Hayle, denounced capitalism. He said he hated it. It's contrary to the common man, he would say, Wilson said, at a time when the United States was enjoying prosperity and industrial progress such as never seen before. That's correct. Wilson called the economy stagnant and proposed a revolution to get things moving again. Strange reasoning, isn't it? That is, if we overlook the fact that Wilson was preaching unadulterated socialism. We stand in the presence of a revolution, not bloody revolution. America is not given to spilling blood, that is, but a silent revolution whereby America will insist upon recovering and practice these ideas, which she has always professed, upon securing a government devoted to the general and not special interests. The most important thing that was omitted to the speech was that this was to be a socialist revolution, one of stealth and boundless in its deceit, based upon British Fabian socialist ideas and principles. Wilson didn't make a prophetic prediction, at least seemingly prophetic, except that upon closer examination, he was merely spelling out the socialist agenda for the United States. You see, these are these little words they use also. We are upon the threshold of a time when the systematic life of the country will be sustained, or at least supplemented at every point by government activity. There's the key word. And we now have to determine what kind of government activity it shall be, whether in the first place it shall be directed from government itself, or whether it shall be indirect through instrumentations which have already constituted themselves and which stand ready to succeed government. The people of America remain largely ignorant of the fact that a sinister force was at play, totally foreign to themselves and the Constitution, which had somehow insulated itself into power by placing a chief executive in the White House, a leader totally beholden to a ruthless and power-hungry group as could be found anywhere in the world, including Bolshevik Russia. That power bringing the Fabian socialists in Britain and the United States. This trend has continued unto today, and as we are seeing, now has President Clinton at his eager self and anxious to please chief executives. The high hopes of the ants seeking to carry off the rubber tree plant is slowly and exorbitantly being realized, folks. A great nation, the United States of America, seems totally unaware of the criminality behind socialism and ignorance of its purpose, and is therefore ill prepared to call a halt to the criminal depredation taking place before its very eyes. How is it possible Wilson to have deceived the American people on such monstrous matters as gradual income tax, something foreign to the Constitution, and which the country has been able to do without up to 1913? Yeah, it is, isn't it? It wasn't even, but you already saw it coming in the 1890s. They were already pushing it. But one man here, Wilson, who was a progressive socialist, he was brainwashed. You see, just like Clinton was, and others. For answers, we need to look again at the socialist ability to implement their program by stealth, by deceit, and by outright falsehood, while crouching in on language that seemed to indicate the poisonous dish it was preparing was for the good of the people. The first hurdle Wilson had to overcome was disbanding trade tariffs that had protected American trade and made it prosperous. It made it a prosperous nation. It's not rocket science, folks. That's why we're in such a mess now. We don't make anything. That's why NAFTA was a destruction of this country. North American free trade. It's not free trade, folks, only for those who are the major corporations to eliminate their competitors here in the United States. That's what it was about. And to rob other people of jobs here, which you had a furniture industry in North Carolina, you had a textile industry in the South. All those jobs are gone. And also the Rust Belt, the jobs there are gone. And look at the coal industry, they're gone. There's nothing wrong with coal, folks. And you notice another little thing happened here, especially in South Carolina. Oh, natural gas is, it's cheap, such and such. That was taught to us like 5 or 6 years ago. That's a bunch of bullshit. You see now? You see what's going on? It's not cheap anymore. They do this every time to you. These liars, that's all they are. They're liars. Stinking lawyers who run for office, and people, we have to have a lawyer to run the business. No, we don't. Best thing to do is not vote, period. And free people should promote such manufacturers as tend to render them independent on others for essential particular military supply. You know that we buy military supplies from China, folks? Do you know that? Hello? We are a dependent country, over 350 million people, I think, or 330, and we're in far worse shape than ever. Ever. These wide words set in motion a system of tariff barriers that impose custom duties on countries wishing to sell their goods in the United States market. The antithesis of so-called free trade, which was nothing more than a subterfuge devised by Adam Smith to allow British to dump its goods on a market with no reciprocity for American goods on the English market. You see, the impression was somehow cultivated, possibly through control of the press, that the United States had developed the living standard of its people on the basis of free trade. But in reality, it was protected trade. It was the opposite. They protected their own country. You see? We saw this deception come to the fore during the Perot-Gore debate, when Gore falsely and with malice aforethought against the people of the United States, denouncing tariff barrier protectionism as they always say that protectionism as the cause. That's bullshit. 1929 Wall Street was destroyed by the banks. Period. All of them. If the Federal Reserve System wasn't there, there wouldn't have been a Wall Street crash, folks. It has nothing to do with trade protectionism. Bullshit. First, Perot was not actually versed in the Smoot-Hawley Acts to defend it against the lies of the vice president, but free trade was spelled out as a Marxist doctrine in a speech made by Marx in 1848. This was not a new thing, folks, but was first proposed by Adam Smith to undermine the economy of the young American country. A wise Washington realized that protection of American fledgling industry was needed. This wise protection policy was carried on by Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, all those before. For 125 years, Americans benefited greatly from the wise policy until the Wilson socialist wrecking ball was used to change the face of the United States. And we are reaping that now, even far more since the 1990s under the Clinton administration. Let me check on my time here. I don't want to go too far here. Okay, 47 minutes, probably another few more minutes, and we'll probably stop that. So here we go. Let's go back to what we're doing here. Oops, wrong button. Okay. Even as late as up to World War II, only 2% of the economy in the United States depended on foreign trade. Yet to hear it now, the United States will perish if it does not do away with the last vestiges of our wise terror bearers. What Wilson did was treason, and the Congress committed suicide or sedition by going along with his devastating attack on the living standards of the American people. We had it good, folks. We really did. But somebody forgot who was actually steamboating us into a wreck, so to speak. For the most part, the Wilson administration badly mauled the Constitution. No sooner had the famous socialists got Wilson elected than he called for a joint session of the Congress. By 1900, and mostly Republican governments had maintained existing trade barriers and erected fresh tariff barriers to protect the American farmer, the industry, and producers of raw materials. The allegation against protected tariff barriers had its origin in London among members of the famous socialists who were in control of the Royal Institute for International Affairs. Ideas for breaching the tariff barriers were fed to Wilson via the seditious Mandel House, directed from London. The anti-tariff propaganda that spewed forth from London is a never-ending stream which has begun in earnest since 1897, and following is an example. The American manufacture reached its highest level of inefficiency. It dropped. American factory reached the highest level of inefficiency in 1907, following a noticeable decline which began in 1897 in several important fields. American manufacturers can now hold their own against foreign competitors in the domestic market. This fact should be brought to the attention of the American people on the basis that because of tariffs, they are paying a higher price for goods. That would be the case if tariff barriers which impede trade were removed. The phrase, the mother of all trades, might be a useful way to describe protectionism, especially if linked to the rising cost of living, which have been attributed to protectionism policies. Note, the Fabian Society Research Department began churning out papers they called tracts if they were allied with Christian missionary efforts. These thousands of tracts were later assembled into books and position papers. The above quotation is taken from a tract published in 1914. What this lying propaganda did not say was that there was no link between the rising cost of living between 1897 and 1902, since tariff rates had no effect on domestic prices. But this did not stop a concerned attack by the major newspapers. Don't believe anything that comes in the newspaper, folks. All they do is lie. They lie about every goddamn thing out there. Stop being naive. God's sake. From blasting tariff protections that cause a rise of cost of living. This was echoed by the London Economists and other magazines owned by the City of London bankers. Hello. Sedition was not confined to Democrats. Many so-called progressive Republicans, as progressive and moderate, had always met socialists, joined in the attack on protective tariffs. How did the socialists succeed in getting the Congress to go along with their plans to wreck our trade? The envy of the world. They did it by combining sociology with politics, which technique pushes socialists to high positions from where they can exert their utmost undue influence on national issues of vital importance. As an example, take the matter of diplomatic recognition for the barbarous Bolshevik government. Thanks to the good offers of Arthur Henderson in 1929, British recognized the Bolshevik butchers as the legitimate government of Russia. Did you know that the British sent troops actually to fight in the civil war that took place in Russia? Did you know that the U.S. sent troops also? Very small group, but they did send troops. And then within a few years, this was done to Wilson, folks. So within, this is 1929. So we're talking like 15 years later, maybe. In fact, let me think here real quick. I'll get to it in a second. British recognized the Bolshevik with such Russia. They then turned their attention to the United States, and thanks to socialists installed in high places, got the United States to do likewise. They did almost these actions by the leaders of the English-speaking world gave the Bolshevik prestige and respect to which they were obviously not entitled, and opened the doors to diplomatic contacts, trade, and economic matters that would otherwise have remained firmly shut for decades, perhaps for all time. Fabian socialists, both in the United States and Britain, appeared in such a benign light, and their highly cultural background and great personal charm made it very hard to believe those who were warning that these affable social elite were a subversive group desirous of stripping the right to own property and threatened to carry off the United States Constitution piece by piece. It just didn't seem possible to think of this elite group as revolutionary and anarchist, which in essence is exactly what they were. A prime example of this was Colonel Edward Mandell House, who was not only a properly convenient, in every aspect, conveniently in every sense of the word, but conservative in manner and speech, at least while in earshot of the public, but one who moved in circles that were far from what one would imagine a group of anarchists to look like. It was this group of affallible, anarchists who elected Woodrow Wilson. As House saw it, United citizens were little better than dots who could be deceived by appearance. Yeah, we're so naive. We're just so fucking naive. We trust anybody in a political suit. We vote for them just because they tell us something good, when all the time, that's all they do is lie to you. It's so gullible, so certain that the voters would not see the nomination of Wilson as a candidate made in England. House sailed for Europe on the day that Wilson was nominated as the Democratic convention in Baltimore in 1912. I feel no need to watch the proceedings, House told Walter Hines, who had introduced him to Wilson the year before. On his arrival in England, House told a gathering of Fabian socialists of the RIIA, I was confident that the American people would accept Wilson without question, and so it was. Wilson went on to become the president, his main task being to undermine the Constitution and mandated by Ramsay MacDonald without the American people ever becoming aware of it. In true Fabian style, socialist style, House had often expressed his hatred of the Constitution in private discussion with his secret backers in Wall Street. These are all traitors. He called the United States Constitution a creation of 18th century minds, not only outmodel, but grotesque, adding it ought to be scrapped at once. We shall return the man Wilson called his greatest friend. As House put it, Wilson was elected to carry out a socialistic agenda without alarming the people. How this was done was laid out in Fischer's version of the blueprint of Fabian socialist long-range goals. And you can see that, you can read that in Philip Drew, Administrator. It was a remarkable confession of socialist planning and strategies to be used against the American people, very revealing in how socialists expect the presidency of the United States to be subverted and undermined. Published by Fabian socialist B.W. Huesbosch, Huebsch, the book should have set alarm bells ringing across America, but unhappily failed to make clear to the American people what House stood for. It set the agenda for the Wilson presidency as clearly as it has been presented to the Congress by House himself. Philip Drew, actually House, that's who it was written about, proposed that he become the ruler of America by a series of executive orders. Among the tasks Drew set himself was establishing a panel of economics to work on the destruction of tariff law, which would eventually lead to the abolition of the theory of protection as government policy. That's what your government's supposed to do, folks. They're supposed to protect you in your own country, not allow other foreigners to come in and sell products cheaper or more inferior, whatever, to keep people who have jobs, so to speak. The panel would also work out a system of gradual income tax and institute new banking laws. They did enormous stuff, folks, enormous. In the two administrations, took us to war too. Created a phony Federal Reserve System for private bankers to loan money to the federal government when it's actually the responsibility of the government to create the money themselves. Note the sly use of the word theory. Protective tariffs were no more theory. Custom duties had earned the United States a living standard that was the envy of the world. Trade protection was an established doctrine set in place by George Washington, which had proved its worth for 125. So we suddenly scrap that and go to something else. And by the way, I just won't go there. How could Drew call tariff protection a theory? Obviously, it was an attempt to denigrate and belittle the concept and open the way for the socialist idea of free trade, which would begin the decline of the living standards of the American people. It was also where Wilson got his income tax idea from. See, hey, let's no longer force them, the corporations, let's put it all on the people's backs, folks. Let's make them pay. What a bunch of Satanists. Bunch of sick people. If you are not feeling upset about what goes on, something's wrong with you. Would further erode the middle class living standards. Wilson violated his oath to uphold the U.S. Constitution on at least 50 separate occasions. That's why I call him the worst president ever. Even worse than Roosevelt. At least you knew what you was getting with Roosevelt. Wilson was another kind of guy. In Wilson, the Committee of 300 found that the ideal man to begin the socialization of America, just as later years, they found another ideal candidate for the anarchist purposes was Bill Clinton. A second parallel between Wilson and Clinton is to be found in the type of advisors with whom they surrounded themselves with. In the Wilson inner circles were prominent people such as anarchist socialists and communists such as Louis D. Brandeis, Felix Frankfurt, Walter Lippmann, Bernard Baruch, Sidney Hillman, Florence Kelley, and of course, Edward Mandell House, a close friend of Roosevelt's mother, lived 2 blocks away from New York State Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt and met frequently to give him advice on how to pay for his coming socialist programs also. Yes, he helped him out. Definitely. The first attack of the Constitution was Ramsay MacDonald's declaration that the Constitution had to be altered. The second attack was carried out by House, whose father had made millions of dollars during the Civil War by doing the bidding of the Rothschilds and the Warburgs. You know, it never changes, does it? After his meeting with Wilson in 1911, through the good office of Walter Hines, House was certain that he had found the right man to carry out the job of altering the U.S. Constitution as mandated by MacDonald on January 14, 1898. House began to cultivate Wilson, who was flattered by the attention of a man who seemed to know everybody in Washington. Oh, brother. Oh, God. A little 3-year-old here. There's a distinct parallel between House and Miss Pamela Harriman, indeed, who saw in Clinton the ideal man to carry out a wide variety of socialist reforms also without alarming the people. Miss Harriman also knew everybody in Washington. House knew that Wilson would need tutoring by an ardent socialist, so he arranged for Wilson to meet Harvard Law professor Louis D. Brandeis. The meeting was to prove ominous for the future well-being of the nation. As Brandeis was committed to making the Constitution of no effect using the legislative route, Brandeis was already writing his predilections into law by interpreting the Constitution in such a manner as to make it of no effective base on sociological premises and not constitutional law. In other words, it was effective based on sociological premise and not on constitutional law. So they skewed it. The third Fabian socialist attack in the United States Constitution came with the founding of the ACLU in January 1920 by the Fabian socialist Philip Lovell, Lovett, and Huebsch. I don't know how to pronounce that, so I'm just going to say it. The publisher of Phil Drew's book, Administrator, was a founding member of the Socialist Body, whose main purpose in life was to alter the U.S. Constitution by what Florence Kelley called the legislative route. Although it is denied, investigators show that there was 4 known communists on the ACLU board in the 1920s. Kelley and her associates worked hard to destroy the United States Constitution through a series of false fronts, such as the National League of Women Voters. As we shall return to that later, this was the beginning of the defeminizing of women by the socialists. This is another thing that was actually important for you to understand. The Greeks always upheld their women. They put her on a pedestal. We did that too, folks. We uplifted women because we knew how important women were in order to train and having kids for the next future. And they destroyed the Greeks the same way. Same thing, had high respect. Even Germany was at one time the same thing, had high respect for and respect of women, because they understood the idea of family is the foundation of any great country, you see. Many of the most important socialist and communist leaders in the United States were closely associated with the ACLU, while some even sat on its national committee. One of those was Robert Moss Lavelle, a director and close friend of Norman Thomas and Paul Blanchard, and were allied with Protestants and other Americans united for the separation of church and state. Thomas was a former clergyman turned communist. Lavelle's charming manner and pleasant demeanor belied the fact that under his affable manner lurked a dangerous anarchist radical of the worst stripe in an attempt to fit. Lavelle once blew up and revealed his true character. I hate the United States. I would be willing to see the whole world blow up if it would destroy the United States. Wow. Lavelle personified the highly dangerous side of the Fabian socialists. In researching statements made by communists against the United States, I was never able to find one so vicious or in intent as it made by Lavelle of the ACLU. It might be worthwhile to give a short history of the ACLU, that is the American Civil Liberties Union, at this point in this book. ACLU grew out of the 1914-1918 Civil Liberties Bureau, which was against militarism. One of its first directors was Roger Baldwin, who had spent time in prison for evading the draft. In his very revealing advisory letter in membership, affiliates, and friends of the ACLU, Baldwin used traditional Fabian socialist deceptive tactics to concede the real intent and purpose of the ACLU. Do steer away from making it look like a socialist enterprise. We want also to look like patriots in everything we do. We want to get a good lot of flags, talk a great deal about the Constitution and what our forefathers wanted to make of the country, and show that we are really the folks that really stand for the spirit of our institutions. Ever the later emblem of the British fable, society fit. This is the wolf in sheep's clothing par excellence. In 1923, Baldwin forgot his own advice, revealing his true colors. I believe in revolution, not necessarily the forceful seizure of power in armed conflict, but the process of growth of class movements determined to expropriate the capitalist class and take control of all social property. Being a pacifist because I believe nonviolence means best calculated in the long run to achieve enduring results. I am opposed to revolutionary violence, but I would rather see violence revolution than none at all, though I would not personally support it because I consider other means far better. Even the terrible cost of bloody revolution is a cheaper price to pay to humanity than the continual exploitation and wreck of human life under the settled violence of the present system. In 1936, Baldwin explained some of his terminology used by the Fabian socialists. He stated, by progressive, I mean force. Forces which working for the democratization of democracy of industry by extending public ownership and control, which alone will abolish the power of the comparative few who own the wealth. It didn't happen, folks. That was never the deal. You see, that's still in their hands. It's now far fewer now than they were in 1900. Real democracy means strong trade unions, government regulation of business. No, you don't need a government regulation of business, folks. That's how you destroy everything. You see, ownership by the people of industry that serves the public. Well, that never worked. You see, so the regulation of business simply is coming in and telling, but it's not usually what happens is the big corporations actually pay people to look the other way. And the small companies are the ones who get in trouble somehow. And next thing you know, they're out of business, you see. Just how far the socialists have come down the road to enslaving the United States can be seen by visiting any factory. On the walls of the office will be seeing a bewildering array of permits empowering one thing or another. People think these are, this is something outside of the government, but it's not. OSHA is a government group. EPA is involved. Equal opportunity inspectors have the right to come in and unannounced at any time, interrupt any stop operations while they carry out an inspection to see whether the conditions laid out in their permits have been violated. The deceptive language used by Baldwin did not mean what the average American took them to mean. Baldwin was practicing Fabian socialist techniques on an elite rear guard group who would lead America gently by the hand down the road to slavery. This is socialism at its very worst. No one could have explained the aims and methods of socialism better than the chairman of the ACLU, which today has not altered its standards and methods one single iota. Although its membership never exceeded 5,000 between 1920 and 1930s, the ACLU nevertheless succeeded in infiltrating and permitting every aspect of American life, while it then proceeded to turn upside down. The foremost task of ACLU in the 20s was to legally block the large number of arrests and deportations of communists or anarchists. Isn't it amazing? It fits the bill. In the early 1920s, the socialists were starting their drive to subvert the U.S. Constitution through underhand means, using foreign-born aliens to preach and carry out acts of sedition. Harvard socialist professor Felix Frankfurter acted as the legal guide for the ACLU, whose Roger Baldwin described anarchists, communists, seditionists as victims of the law, members of labor and welfare movements who are being institutionally attacked by unscrupulous men working under the cloak of patriotism. Frankfurter, assisted by Harold Lasky, from behind the scenes, helped President Wilson set up a mediation committee, which committee, prompted by Frankfurter, kept on using the Constitution to qualify the seditionists, anarchists, about enemies of the United States for protection under the United States Constitution. It It was a sort of tactic which he had worked remarkably well since 1920, the misuse of the United States Constitution to grant rights and to protection to every Dick, Tom, and Harry trying to undermine the Confederate Republic as burglary to a dreadful, alarming degree. They turned it over. They changed it, inverted it for their way of actually, oh, no, that meant such and such. So they reinterpreted the Constitution, which is what they've been doing. Others who threw their weight behind persecuted immigrants and victims of the law, in which categories were recorded every leftist, arsonist, socialist agitator, murderer, and seditious were Professor Arthur M. Schlesinger Sr. and Harvard Law Professor Francis B. Sayre, S-A-Y-R-E. Wilson's son-in-law. It was the beginning of a huge campaign to trample underfoot the real purpose and intent of the United States Constitution. It was crowned with success beyond the wildest dreams of the sappers of socialism in this country. This was a period when the United States was trying to rid the country of a flood of communists who came here to commit acts of sedition in an attempt to communize or socialize the country. Socialist Upton Sinclair wrote Rims in defense of hardcore seditionists, and Harvard Law School sent some of his best socialists into the fray, including its dean, Roscoe Pound. The news media, including magazines like The Nation and Review Republic, did their level best to cloud the straightforward legal issue by constantly referring to the Red Scare. In 1919, the Obermann Committee on Bolsheviks of the United States Senate authored exhaustive inquiries, came to a conclusion that the Fabian Socialist was a grave threat to the citizens of the United States, especially to women and children. And I'm going to stop there, folks. I'm pretty tired. This is a work. This is a enormous work by the key figures that John Coleman has done. He's looked at these, found these guys, researched these guys. I'm sure I haven't looked at his bibliography, but I'm sure he's read a ton of books at that point, and how they destroyed this country. And Wilson went along with it completely. He hasn't even talked about the issue of the constitutional amendment that was applied that allowed that no longer the senators were appointed by the states, that is 2 senators, and given that power to the people. People think that's great. In reality, that was a Republican form of government, was the states choosing them, that is. People say, well, that's not in the hands. No, you still elect the state legislators, folks, okay? But what happened simply was you altered it. You gave it what I call, you see, democracy is mob rule. Get that in your head, because that's only 50% plus one who actually has more rights than the minority. That's what democracy is always about, folks. It's not about an equal opportunity for those who are the minority or the majority. It was always a balance, you see. But when they did that with democratic and democracy, meant that simply the 50% plus one vote could actually dominate the other group, you see. And that's why, in my lifetime, since Clinton, it's been, maybe even before then, but mainly then, that there's a huge battle between the right and left, which is what they want. They want to keep it divided, keep the country divided, and never come to the real reason who is really the enemy here, you see. But we'll talk and do this again. It's because it's getting late here. It's about 10:30 here on the East Coast. So again, I'm trying to educate you, but you need to have ears to hear, you need to have eyes to see, and you need to have courage to see the truth. Okay? So we'll talk to you another time, and I hope you have a good night, and we wish you well.